Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to the Truth Factor discussion. You know, this is a time that we set aside each week so that we can come together in this internet age, study habit, mannerism, to factor the truth of God's Word into our daily lives. We don't rehearse this, we don't script it, as you can just tell from what I just said. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you all doing? Let's start with you, Paul.
Doing great, John. Sure good to see you guys today, and sure glad for all those who are joining us in the chat. And looking forward to a good study today. If you haven't joined the chat, you can just click on the word guest underneath the chat window and type in your name, and then you can ask questions or make comments, and we always welcome those. Whatever your question or comment is, we'll introduce that, and we will work to understand and to study together so that we might know what the truth is so that we can factor it into our daily lives. Tom, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. Everything is going well. As always, this is a part of the week I look forward to, so it's good to be here as we're going to be continuing our study of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 up to about verse number 11. So things are going well here on the West Coast. Of course, I used to be the furthest west, but no longer. So how are you doing, Daniel?
I'm doing wonderful, brother. I appreciate that. Aloha to everyone. If you notice in the bottom now, for those who don't know, I moved to Hawaii, and so HI is the abbreviation for Hawaii. I'm not just trying to be friendly by saying hi. I will try to be friendly, but that part of it is merely the abbreviation there. And also, maybe you'll be able to notice from my better computer today, the sun has not risen yet, so maybe you'll get to see more light as time progresses. But I look forward to our discussion and just hope all of you will follow along in our discussion of 1 Corinthians and contribute comments and questions, and we'd be happy to have any of those.
What time is it there, Daniel?
6 a.m.
6 a.m. It's noon here, so 6 hours.
Yes, sir.
No, it's just 3 hours difference.
Very, very good. All right, well, let's go ahead and get our study underway. We left off last week having studied through 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 10. And what we're going to do is briefly look at verses 11 and 12, the first half of 12. And then we will pick up with the latter half of 12. Paul changes thoughts just a little bit there in his study. Now, the primary point that we were looking at last week is Paul appears to be putting forth a scriptural defense of preachers being supported by the gospel. Not preachers in general necessarily. He tends to be defending his and Barnabas's right to receive support in their endeavors to preach the gospel. And what we'll find a little bit later here, that it does appear that when Paul had originally gone through Corinth, that he had not received support from them and had a reason for not doing so, and possibly this might have backfired a little bit on him. But in verses 11 and 12, let me call that up here real quick. Bear with me just a second there. I thought I had this prepped earlier. And notice here he says in verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more also? So we'll pause here for just a moment, because what he's doing here in this case in point is saying we have sown spiritual things. It is only reasonable that we would reap from you physical things. Other people are able to do this. Why not us? Any thoughts or comments about that?
No, he obviously puts a priority on spiritual things. You know, making the observation of the importance of the spiritual over the physical. But of course the point is if our priorities are where they ought to be, then the material aspects are going to be secondary in our life. And of course that means we ought to be willing to help somebody that's preaching the gospel if it's going to further the gospel.
Well, one thing to note, and I probably should have read verse 10. It does connect a little bit better. He uses it, going back to the illustration of not muzzling the oxen as the Old Testament scriptures taught. He makes the point, for our sakes, this is written. No doubt this is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of this hope. If we've sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? You know, the two kind of connect there. So it just makes sense. If a preacher is going to preach among a local congregation and sow the spiritual seed and tend to the spiritual needs, it makes sense that they would tend to his physical needs.
The picture that's portrayed there of the ox is as it's working, that it can, through the field, it can partake of that grain that's there,
Right.
as it's doing the work. And so just saying that those who work should have the ability to partake of the necessities of life and be rewarded or be compensated for the work that they do, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is he saying that preachers are as dumb as an ox?
You know, we talked about this last week. I think it was more talking about the yokes that preachers tell.
Oh, we had to go there, didn't we?
He started it. One more time. All right. Well, let's continue though with his thoughts. And if you're in the chat room with us today, those in the chat room, we definitely love to hear from you. He continues here, beginning with the latter half of verse 12, with this defense, showing that preachers do have the right, those who labor in the gospel have the right to partake of the gospel. But now he's going to make an interesting comparison, looking at the priesthood under the Mosaical law and how the priests themselves were supported. So, Tom, I'll throw this to you. Let's start our reading there, and we're going to start right in the middle of verse 12, if you would. Okay. And let's read through, verse 14. 14. Very short reading here, yeah.
Okay. And again, we're starting in the middle of it. Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offering of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel.
All right. Thank you, Tom. So let's step back into this, and let's take a moment to look at this for just a moment there. We start with the nevertheless. He says, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel. So Paul is saying here that there was at one point where they did not and they were unwilling to receive support from the church at Corinth.
That's right. He says they have not used the right. The right that he mentions there is that those who work in the gospel can live of the gospel. They can be taken care of by the church for the work that they do. That spiritual work, that they can receive earthly things to take care of them in doing that spiritual work. He talks about earlier how they have sown spiritual things, and they partook. Would it be okay for them to take of the physical things? Certainly it is. And so the right that he's talking about is that there is a right there, but it was a right that Paul was willing to forego, and he's just explaining that to them.
Yeah, in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 9, he says, "And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need." And so he said, "So I refrain and will refrain from burdening you in any way." And he chose to not take support from Corinth. He certainly had the right and to do so. He certainly had the need. It was just met by different brothers and sisters because of this situation. It was in Paul's wisdom that he chose not to take support from them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. All right, any thoughts or comments about that?
We discussed last time about sometimes how churches can become maybe I don't know if spoiled's the right word, or just accustomed might be the best way to say that, to a preacher who doesn't require much support. Maybe he's independently wealthy, or he has some other kind of income that's able to take care of him. And maybe Paul's kind of addressing that here, is that we didn't do that. We were able to be supported, as Daniel pointed out, by other brethren. But he does take time to mention that there is a right there. And so in future circumstances, the Corinthians would know to expect that for those who labor among them, that they would support them.
Okay, all right.
Right. Be reminded also, it is in Corinth, I believe, where we read of Paul making tents. Isn't that correct?
When he stayed with with Priscilla and Aquila.
Yeah, Aquila and Priscilla. He's making tents there in Corinth. And my point is Paul's refusal to take support from the Corinthians wasn't because he didn't need it. It was because of the issues that it would cause. And that's why he was willing to work as well as receive support from other places. You know, rather he be because apparently he knew what some were going to say. You know, somehow he could perceive, or he had been told what they would say.
Yeah.
About him as a Jew preaching to the Gentiles, which I think is implied as the primary reason, or there's an underlying clue. That's the primary reason why they were so critical of him. You know, because I mean, he was going against the norm with the superiority of the Jews.
If we understand the time placement of when Paul wrote this epistle, it looks like in Acts chapter 18, on his second journey, he stayed a year and a half in Corinth, if I read that right. And he continued there a year and 6 months. And then from there, he travels over to Ephesus, where he stays for almost double, if not more, that amount of time. And some scholars say that it was from Ephesus that he likely wrote this first letter to the church of Corinth, based on a few things. So I guess my point is, it must be the year and a half that he was in Corinth. We assume it's at that point that he didn't receive wages. And by the time he got to Ephesus, word was getting to him that there was some questioning of whether or not he should maybe need support while he travels, you know, like he talks about others that having helped him. But for whatever reason, he sees the need to correct this, correct this understanding of the brethren.
Right.
It's just interesting to look at the time place. A year and a half here, then he travels to Ephesus, and during his 3 years here, he now sees the need to write to the church of Corinth and maybe straighten a few misunderstandings out.
Right.
Which is possible. All right, so what I find interesting here, though, about 13, and there's really no reason to hang too long with these, unless you in the chat room have comments, and I need to look at that, and y'all don't let me talk through those. If I miss something, please let me know. Yeah. But in verse 13, he says, "Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar?" I mean, going back to even the structure that God had established under the Levitical priesthood. The priesthood, part of what they lived on was the sacrifices, the meat from the sacrifices that were brought to the temple. And so he's just showing again the wisdom of God in establishing a pattern whereby those who labor in the gospel should live of the gospel. All right, any thoughts?
Yeah, and in saying the word "should" there in verse 14, he's not saying that it's wrong for a preacher not to take that wage, because here, Paul selected not to do that. But certainly, it should be anticipated by the brethren that a preacher ought to be supported in the work that he's doing.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's in verse 13. You see another example of him using the Old Testament that there was a teaching point in there. You know, when the Levites or those who served on the altar, etc., were able to partake of the sacrifice and those blessings, there was an Old Testament principle along with, you know, the oxen example that was set down, and here is used for a specific principle that's taught that those who serve the Lord can benefit from material things that come from it.
Yeah, exactly. Tom, any thoughts?
Yeah. No, let's see. I guess it slipped my mind. You know, I was just making observations about the about looking at the old law. When you study the history of the way Israel treated their priests, there were times when they were not neglected, or they were neglected. You know,
Right.
Paul, God made provisions for them to be well taken care of. You know, equally, basically equally to what the rest of the people were, because, you know, the tenth that was to be given was going to help them, and with the 12 tribes, it just about was supposed to balance out. So they weren't supposed to be living on starving wages and stuff like that just because they were the priests. There was to be a degree of honor there, and so on.
Well, it's even a system we see abused with the sons of Samuel, if I remember correctly, as well as the sons of Eli. You know, but it was designed for them. All right. Well, that being said, let's continue then with verse 15. And Daniel, I'll throw this to you if you'd like to read verses 15 through 18.
15 through 18?
Yes.
Okay. It says, "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? Then in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel."
All righty. Thank you, Daniel. All right, let's back up there to verse 15. He makes the point here, and let me step back over to the right. I was going to say to the right translation, but to the one I read from as we go through the study. Notice there in verse 15, he makes the point. He says, "But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things, that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void." The great question, of course, is what is Paul speaking of when he talks about his boasting? And his boasting here, as we see as we go through the text here, is simply the fact that he's preaching the gospel. He's not doing it for pay. He's not doing it for selfish gain. He's not doing it against his own will, if we understand 17 right. But he's doing it so that the gospel itself is preached. And he doesn't want to abuse the rights that he would have within that. And so it may be that when he was at Corinth living with Priscilla and Aquila, who were fellow tent makers, he saw the need not to take a wage from the church there in Corinth, but instead supported himself. He didn't want the gospel, or he didn't want that to be used as something to hinder his work within the faith there. Any thoughts about that?
Well, certainly we see some wisdom in this, and I suppose we could say the wisdom of the Holy Spirit as these words of inspiration are given, but also something that kind of makes sense is that Paul is saying, and he's teaching this spiritual principle, that those who labor in the gospel should be able to partake of material things as part of that work that they do. But Paul's saying, I'm not saying that so that you will either feel guilty that you didn't pay me, or that you would try to send something to me at this point. He's just making the point to them that here is something that you ought to expect, and maybe as other preachers would either be sent to them or they would seek out men to work with them, that they would know that that's something that ought to be anticipated. But Paul says, but not me. I don't want to partake in that. And so he can give these instructions in a bold way, maybe in a similar way to someone who comes along in a gospel meeting and can talk to the congregation about how they ought to support their preacher. And in doing that, he's going to go on and go his way. It's not him that he's speaking of, but he's trying to help out other circumstances and other men who would labor in that field.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Another observation I would make is, in the term boasting, I kind of believe that Paul is beginning to introduce his sarcasm, if you will. I mean, in other words, I believe he's using the term because he was being accused of boasting. Paul in his humility was also confident, and as he comes into the city of Corinth and other places, he's very confident with the gospel. He's very confident with the gospel being for all man, including the Gentiles, and he's going to, especially in 2 Corinthians, he's going to really defend himself, and that's where he uses the idea of this boasting sarcastically and so on. And so I kind of see, I think the point that he's making here is he has already been criticized. He's got people that are criticizing him already. And so, when he makes the point, it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. I think, among other things, the observation he's making there is that as I preach the gospel, I would rather die than that which you call boasting be nullified. And of course, you're right about what he is talking about is the preaching of the gospel.
Well, I wonder about that, Tom. And Daniel, let me throw this to you. In the English Standard Version, the latter half of verse 15, they say, he writes, "For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting." I wonder, is really, do you think the boasting here sarcastic, or do you think that Paul was talking about his ability to preach the gospel, but not because he's doing it for money or by force, but because he's doing it of his own free will? Could that be the boasting?
Yeah, that would be the way I lean personally. In fact, in verse 15, he talks about, "I have not made any use of these rights." In verse, 17, "For if I do this on my own will," and so I think his emphasis is on his entirely his own personal choice. That's just the way that I lean, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Paul or Tom?
Yeah,
Tom, I wasn't so much contradicting you, but I think the boasting here isn't so much sarcastic, but the fact that he's able to say, "I'm preaching the gospel of my own free will, not by force, not by coercion,
right,
and not even because of pay."
Right. Yeah. And again, what I see in it is that what he's doing is going to be perceived that way. It's going to be perceived as boasting.
Okay.
And so that's why I don't think he's really being sarcastic at this time. But he is setting up to defend himself. Verse 16, "If I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me." He's dealing with the idea there of his pride and his ability to do what he's doing. A challenge that preachers have, some more than others, is to preach the word with confidence. And there's a thin line in some instances between confidence and arrogance. And it's easy for confidence to be portrayed as arrogance when it's not meant that way. And
no, Tom, I am always confident and never arrogant.
Yeah.
Just for
yeah. And so that's kind of the challenge. Here, Paul has taken upon himself a personal right to not take support from them. You know, are there those people there that are saying, do you think you're better than us? You don't want our money? And then there's others that if he were to take it, you know, he's doing this just for the easy job or whatever, those kinds of things. So that's what I see in this expression. I mean, he's going to deal with it sarcastically when he gets into 2 Corinthians.
Well, and I think it's a stretch to say that he didn't receive anything. His point is, I'm sure somebody gave him a glass of water sometime. He worked with Christians, you know. I'm sure they shared things sometimes, but his major support didn't come from them, you know. And part of that was for the fact that he could boast that, hey, I'm doing this on my own personal choice, not to get some financial gain out of it. In fact, you know, I'm sure he didn't get monthly support checks from Macedonia. Those were, you know, one-time supports, more or less, what they were, you know, that came in every once in a while. And, you know, they didn't have the post-delivery. They didn't have direct deposit. And so he was totally relying on him, on really God, I'll say that, to supply his needs in his efforts.
I was going to.
You had some comments in the chat room too, but
I was just real briefly, and we can get right to that. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think what we see here is that Paul's emphasis is the same that it is on other occasions. That all he's really interested in, not about any physical benefit, not about any reputation. He's just interested in the gospel being preached, and he says that I don't want to do anything that would cause the message that I preach to be inhibited or to be restrained or to be received in the wrong way. I'm not going to do anything that's going to get in the way of that. You know, on another occasion, Paul talked about those who preach the gospel out of impure motives, supposing to add affliction to Paul. And he says, what then? Only that in every way Christ is preached. And I think that's what he's interested in here is, he said, I'm not taking that, though I had a right to. And I really think that we're still referring back to the previous section where he's called upon them to forego liberties that they have. And Paul's here illustrating that he's foregone liberties that he has so that the gospel could progress and could be preached faithfully.
Right. You know, and I think that just gives good wisdom to us as preachers that, you know, hey, you know, receiving financial support for your needs is great, but you know, there does come a point where you don't want to be receiving so much support that people start to question, well, are you just doing this for the money? You know, if they look at you and you know you're driving a Ferrari around, you know, I'm using an extreme case, but then they're going, are you really doing this out of sincere motives? And so as preachers, we have to be careful about, you know, even the maximum amount of support that we receive as well, that the perception that it could give.
Daniel, I would agree with that, but I think we ought to just be real careful. I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but I do think that we ought to make a distinction here that later on Paul's going to talk about benevolence and the giving to needy saints. He doesn't view the preacher here as a needy saint. He views him as a laborer.
Correct.
Who has a right to work, a right to live because of the work that he's doing. If he's not working, he shouldn't eat. But if he's working in the kingdom of God, then he has a right to partake of those material things. He's not a charity case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I heard a story years ago, and it shows one extreme that sometimes people go to. And I remember it might have been down in Florida down when we were at college or one of the summer camps. But someone told me a story about a preacher who had gone out and bought a brand new car. And some of the brethren complained a little bit, and so one of the brethren who were kind of very kind to him walks up to him and says, and talks him basically into returning that new car and buying a used car. Now, to me, that is an extreme, okay? But at the same time, if the preacher drives a car that's nicer than any car that the brethren there locally could even hope to drive, then that might be on the other end of the stick as well, you know. There's nothing says that he can't do that, but just understand if you go driving around one of the nicest cars available and all your members are driving used cars, and your house is bigger than all the other members' houses, some point someone may wonder, especially if you're not working a whole lot, if you're really worth the money they're paying you. You know.
I've not seen that a lot in the United States, but I have heard about that situation taking place sometimes in some of the foreign lands where they're very poor, where sometimes either an American preacher goes there and he is supported to such a level that he lives so far above the people that he works with, or sometimes preachers are able to, native preachers are able to raise so much support that their lifestyle is raised up to a higher level. And it is, I don't think it's a common situation, but it is something that we ought to be aware of.
Right. Because you could have a preacher who manages his money very well, you know, and is able to buy the nice things. It's just expect at some point someone's going to question you, especially if you're not doing the work.
Does a preacher have a right to invest, to have enough so that he can invest and actually think about retiring one day?
Oh yeah, he has every right as every laborer does. Yeah. Yeah,
there's all kinds of debate on that. Anyways.
Well, let's go to the chat room, and for some reason Randall Duvall is masking himself as guest 149. It's not really his choice; the system's doing it. Paul, would you like?
I know the first time he jumped on there, he was Randall Duvall, but maybe it booted him off or something.
Thank you. I thought I saw him as there, and Randall,
you're not crazy. I saw it too.
Randall, we haven't banned you from the chat room, so it's not our fault either.
At least not yet.
What may have been in the chat and whether John is crazy or not are not mutually exclusive.
Thank you. I love you too.
Randall says, John knows I'm teasing. I hope anyway. Randall says, I think it is funny that like so many times with us, the good brethren wait until preachers leave to talk trash about them. These are probably the same men who were Paul's greatest cheerleaders while he was there sacrificing for them. Now apparently they're trashing him for even asking for support, typical of some in the church. Or sometimes the preacher doesn't know how much he's appreciated Randall until he decides that he's going to move on, and then he probably thinks he's going to be fired every other week. Fired, I use that term carefully because I believe the preacher serves the Lord. But here that the brethren are going to cut him off from their support until he decides he's going to leave, and then he becomes very appreciated. And he also says, this is Randall, I agree with your assessment, John, about the boasting. It's not boasting as we perceive it, but the fact that he did it with or without their help. He is going to preach no matter what, with money or without money. And I think that's a good evaluation there. Randall goes on to say, that is the same judgment we used in the Philippines to assess preachers' needs. If the congregation is living in grass huts and the preacher is living in a brick house, he doesn't need more support. But if he is living in a grass hut and everyone else is living in a brick house, he may need some more support. Just an example. He's not trying to make a rule for anybody here, but instead just how they, in their Philippine work, were able to look and to try to make sure that the preacher was supported in a way that was typical of the social setting that he lived in.
I think that's a good general standard. You know, if you can afford to send a representative over to the country where the preacher lives, let them visibly assess the situation. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good standard there. Randy,
I'm just going to say that I'm willing to go over and assess Daniel's situation if folks want to send me to Hawaii to check that out.
I think there probably needs to be two people involved in that, Paul. Not that I don't trust you, but I'd rather be by your side just to, Well,
we have reason to do that, so.
Well,
I could go over there and.
We could do a special, the Truth Factor discussion in Hawaii.
Yeah, there you go.
On the beach in lounge chairs.
Yeah.
Daniel's expensive, of course. So.
Yeah.
It could happen.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No ties.
What Randall pointed out in chat room does remind me of a warning an older preacher gave me years ago we were living in McAllister, Oklahoma at the time, and he came to hold a gospel meeting there. And he warned me. He said, because keep in mind I was young, still in my mid-20s at this point. He said, be careful when you move to congregations. He says the first person out front to shake your hand and welcome you and to do everything for you typically will be the first one who wants you gone when you no longer agree with them. And that was an interesting warning, you know, because I've known a lot of brethren who are very cautious, take a long time to get to know the preacher, but when they do, they're solid. But apparently there are others who want to get the preacher on their side right off the bat, and then if at some point the preacher disagrees with them or does something they don't like, then they're ready for him to go out the door. And interesting warning from an older preacher.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so at some point I'll be able to give that same warning, and I will be that older preacher.
My dad says your wives might have to come assess this living situation in Hawaii as well. So.
Oh. We'll see.
Let's get started on this. Anyways.
Of course, we would want our wives with us there when we go to Hawaii. Absolutely. So, with that being said, then, let's step back into our study now. We've kind of deviated a little bit. Any other thoughts from the chat room?
Not at this point.
Okay. There in verse 16, hang on just a moment. There in verse 16 there, he makes the point there that if he preaches the gospel, he says, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. Sorry, it'll stop reading here in a minute. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. English Standard Version reads, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship, which is a very interesting reading. The point is, even if Paul really wasn't wanting to do this, God has still entrusted him with this stewardship, and so he has to do it. He has no choice but to preach the gospel, and that's what he is setting out to do. All right, any thoughts?
Can you all still hear me okay? My screen froze. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you, Daniel, and you're looking good.
Okay, sounds great. Must just be my end. But, you know, in this verse, I really love this verse personally, in verse 16, where he talks about, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. The fact is that Paul was entrusted by God with this message. The fact is that God gave Paul certain gifts to fulfill this mission. And if Paul were to ignore his gifts, if Paul were to ignore his task that he was personally entrusted with, he would experience basically the wrath of God from that. And so as individuals, we need to be aware of what God has given us and be grateful for what he has entrusted to us in the different talents that we have. You know, the book of Romans talks about, you know, the fact that we're all members of the body, and we, you know, are all different parts of the body, you know, whether we be an eye or a nose or a finger or whatever the case may be. You know, we need to take advantage of those gifts, and not just, if we are blessed by God with certain abilities, to ignore those, because God will not be happy with that situation if we do.
That's right. That's right. It's a good point. Any other thoughts, gentlemen?
I was thinking about what Daniel was saying, and I was looking for the verse here. Paul was told in the conversion account that we have in Acts chapter 9, and he was told some things that he must do, but he was told also that he was going to have to suffer many things for the cause of Christ, that he was going to be a witness of Christ to many different people in many different places. And so he laid upon him as a special charge, and so he does view it here as a great privilege to preach the gospel. But he said even if he didn't view it as a privilege, he needed to be about preaching the Word of God.
Well, you think about the way he words it in verse 18 in the English Standard Version. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. You know, he even viewed that as a privilege, as a reward.
The reference that I had trouble finding it here while I was trying to talk at the same time, was in verse 15. It says, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." And that was convincing Ananias to go when he was not fully convinced that he could talk to Saul, to go talk to him.
That's right. That's right. Brian, in the chat room, he makes the point that he says Paul would declare that his compulsion, verse 16, was the love of Christ, as we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14. That's a good point. And Randall, just you'll see a little bit earlier here, made the point that he would always encourage, if possible, someone to go in person to investigate before sending money to a foreign field. And I think it's a very valid suggestion, especially if you can do that. Yeah. All right. So with that being said, we've got a few minutes remaining. Are we ready to continue verses 19 through 23? And I think the simplicity here is such that we could cover this section very easily and then call this study done for today, and then pick up next week in verse 24. Okay. Notice there, and let's start reading, and let's see, Tom, I'll throw it to you to read if you would. Paul had to step away for just a moment. Let's read beginning in verse 19, Tom, and read through verse 23, please.
Okay. All right. Okay, so he says there, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you."
Okay, thank you, Tom. Let's step back in our text there to verse 19. And it seems to be that what the Apostle Paul is elaborating here on is the sacrifices that he has willingly chose to make. One sacrifice being the willingness to preach without support from the gospel. But we see here that he views himself, although he is free, as a freed man can be, he views himself as a servant to all. His responsibility is to teach all men, and that's what he owes them. And so he illustrates this, beginning in verse 20 there, the various adaptations, if you would, if we understand this wording properly, the adaptations that Paul would go through so that he might better communicate with the different individuals. And he gives several examples. Go ahead.
In this, I think this goes counter to all culture in perception of what a preacher, should be. Is oftentimes the preacher in denominations is esteemed above the congregation, but Paul views himself as the lowest of the congregation. He says that he will be a slave to all. That's his view. Now, the fact is, he's not their slave. They can't abuse him. That's not their right. But he has made himself their slave. He's put himself beneath everybody, not above everybody, but beneath everybody, which really is the same mindset that he shares in, I think it's Philippians 2, verse 3 or 4 or something, where he says that we should put everybody above ourselves. Right. That's the view that we should have. And Paul doesn't, he practices what he preaches. I'll say that. Yeah. I'll say the positive side of it. He practices what he preaches. And I'll also say that in this passage, too, that I might win more of them. That'd be really impossible if Calvinism was correct and there were only a certain predetermined number of people to be saved. How could Paul win more than the quota that God already quoted? So I love this verse against Calvinism's predestination.
Right. Yeah. Now, Daniel, would you say that Paul was putting himself beneath them or equal to them? And what I mean by that is, we know he's an apostle, and so on, which is by God a high office. I kind of see this as his being equal. In other words, he becomes like them to whatever degree he can, so that he will have a chance to have as much influence with them as possible.
I see in Paul there, I had to step away for just a moment, but I see in Paul there, in kind of answering that question, not for Daniel, but for myself, that Paul is esteeming others better than himself, to think about another passage of Scripture. When it comes to his authority, though, and his apostolic authority, his right to command, he has no problem exercising that in a very bold and powerful way. But when it comes to matters here that he can concede, or he can allow himself to be at a lower level than what he might otherwise be, he says that he'll make himself a servant, and so and he would esteem them higher and serve them in that.
And in the situation of a slave, I don't think you could ever find an instance in Scripture where a slave was equal to or greater than the person they were a slave to. And so that's why I would view him as inferior.
Yeah.
He calls himself a slave.
Good point. Yeah. Okay. Good point there. So.
Well, and this is talking about his own personal view in comparing himself to others. For instance, if he's going to go to the Jews and try to teach the Jews, he's going to become as a Jew. He's not going to say, y'all need to come to me and be what I already understand. Let me come to you so that I might teach you better. Almost as if what he owes them. To the Jews, he owes the responsibility to teach them, and so he begins where he needs to so that he might teach the Jews. Yeah. He says to those who are under the law, as under the law, and those who are without law, as without law. I said adaptation a while ago. I'm not sure if that's the best word, because we're not saying that Paul would take on sinful practices in order to teach sinners.
No.
But he would put himself on their learning level so that he might be able to better communicate with them.
And I would say not just their learning level, but also in his association with them. You use the illustration of the common meal. Having a meal with one of them. I mean, somebody that's arrogant might say, to the Jew, I don't eat pork, or I mean to the Gentile, I don't eat pork. Those kinds of things.
Sure.
So I see that in this as Paul is adapting his life to where, without compromising the gospel, he can be like them as much as possible. Do the things that they do. Put himself in their environment so that he has a chance to relate to them, and hopefully they can relate to him. Okay. And I think one of the goal is the gospel.
I think one of the great travesties that I've heard in the interpretation of this verse, which is not made by anybody here, is that somehow Paul became fake in his life. And I don't think that's his point at all. I think he was genuine in everything that he was doing. When he was adapting himself, he genuinely was participating in those things. Yeah. He wasn't putting on this fake facade to try to trick people into obeying the gospel. His point was trying to adapt to people and let them know, hey, I'm just like you are. When he's around Jews, he'll partake of the Jewish customs to make them, feel more comfortable around him, or the Gentile customs, etc. But his point was, I will do anything to win people to Christ. What, in Corinth? Me getting support from the congregation in Corinth is going to be a problem? No worries, I won't take support from you. If this over here is going to be a hindrance, no worries, I'm not going to do that. This over here will be a hindrance if I don't do it. No worries, I'll start doing that. That's what I'm going to do. It's not, hey, I don't like to do that, so I'm not going to, or an attitude of his selfish desire. But he was just willing to do whatever he could to help others in their spiritual life, and always putting their needs and their wants, their desires, their likes ahead of his in that situation.
When it came to truth, it was uncompromising.
Yes.
But when it comes to matters that he can go either way, matters that don't matter, earthly matters, Paul said, I'll do what's best for my brethren.
You know, you don't like meat sacrificed to idols? Gone. I'll never eat that again. You know, if that bothers you, gone. You know, I have brothers and sisters in Christ who think it is a sin to wear, you know, anything but pants. Guess what? When I'm around them, I'm wearing pants. You know, if there's something that bothers my brother or sister in Christ, and it's not a matter of doctrine, as Paul said, you know, in the sense that it's not going against God. You know, I'll do those things. I'll adapt to that, whatever they need.
Right.
Yeah. That's a good point.
You know, Daniel, I think just an illustration of that is that I think it was you, it may have been someone else. You know, most of the time preachers, when they stand up to teach a class or to preach, in particular to preach, that you'll see us wearing a tie. That's just sort of what people expect. So we wear a tie. It's not any scriptural requirement or anything like that, but it's just a respectful way to dress toward the Lord and toward the congregation as far as that expectation. But I thought it was you that told me that when you got to Hawaii that some of the brethren said that a tie probably wasn't what they would be anticipating. And they would be anticipating different dress. Harry Osborne told me that when he was in the Philippines that he has some Filipino-type shirts that he wears as he goes around teaching. He just go around in a white dress shirt and a tie and a jacket on throughout the Philippines. And so you learn to adapt, I thought was a good word. You learn to be part of the group that you're with, not to compromise any point of truth or not to engage in any sinful activity, but just when you can do things to be able to get along, you do those.
And mine almost was in a opposite direction, that I've never been a big fan of wearing ties or suits, but I know that if that was the culture I was in, guess what, Daniel? I'm going to suck it up. I'm going to wear that because that's what, you know, is expected of me. That's what's going to help adapt. That's what I'm going to do to help represent the congregation, because I don't want to be selfish in my attitude. And here it's different. You know, the month that I've been here, I've seen one person in all of the state of Hawaii who wore a suit, and it's just not the culture in here. And you're exactly right with the Philippines, and so just having that mindset. I'm no perfect example by any stretch of the imagination.
I was just trying to bring it down to a modern day application.
Yeah,
we don't
absolutely.
have some of the issues that they dealt with.
That's what I think. Just we need to be able to be less. I don't know what the word is, but I'll just pass.
Well, I will say, and yeah, let's go this in the other direction. We're talking about you know not wearing a tie, you know, depending on the culture and everything, and dressing up. But I know, like with the congregation here, there's a certain standard that's not enforced. Keep in mind, the elders haven't made a rule that you have to wear a coat and tie, but they would prefer, if a man's going to speak publicly before the congregation, that they wear a coat and tie. And so, there are some gospel preachers out there that I'll see on videos from regular Sundays that if was ever asked to come hold a meeting here, I figured they'd have a hard time getting them to wear a coat. It's you have to consider where you're going to. I mean, it may be that the culture you go to expects you to dress up in a coat and tie. I mean, you just you do what you need to do so that you can best communicate the gospel to them.
Because you wouldn't want a jacket or a tie to interfere with the message being preached and received.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And part of it too is exactly what you guys are saying, that you're not compromising truth. You're not going to see me with coconut bra on and a grass skirt. Okay, so I'm going to be modest in my dress. And I, in fact, I even brought suits, because I know, hey, let's say I go preach at a gospel meeting at a congregation like Seminole Port or something. Guess what? I'm going to wear, my suit and a tie, because, that's the culture there. And I want to respect my brothers and sisters in Christ, because their opinions and their concerns matter more should matter more to us than our own concerns and opinions.
Right.
Unless you like the Denver Broncos, then I have no sympathy or tolerance or anything.
But you do have some that would bear the attitude, there's no way you're going to make me wear a coat, or there's no way you're going to make me wear a tie. I mean, then you've got the flip side of the coin, There is a Bible passage, though, that does support wearing ties. Proverbs 6:21, bind them continually about thine heart, and a tie about thy neck. Wait a minute, I read that wrong. And tie them about thy neck. Okay, well, maybe not
Right. We have comments.
We probably have a lot of comments now, don't we?
Yeah, we have comments.
Let's see. We sure do. Let's back up to... No, we haven't read Randall's comment.
I think he puts himself beneath them is where we should be, I believe.
All right, then Tom, let's start reading there.
Okay, all right. Okay, and again, most of these are Randy's comments here. He makes the point, and this goes back to the discussion that we were having about Paul being equal, being a servant, and so on. He says, I think he puts himself beneath them. Jesus told his disciples to become the least. And he said, I think we should, and the word should be never. I think we should never think of ourselves above others. I agree with Daniel's assessment. Paul is a servant by choice, and I clarified with Randy what he meant there. So
Okay.
No, I've quoted in the article that I'm writing what Randall says there.
Okay. Anyways, he goes on. As John is pointing out, Paul would eat possum with the possum eaters and eat steak with the steak eaters, but always taking the least prominent place at the table.
Yeah.
And he goes on, Paul truly loved the souls of men, which allowed him to become like those he was trying to convert. It was about their souls, not their social status.
That's right.
And finally, Paul's choices came natural to him. He didn't have to take a lot of time thinking about it.
That's a good point.
His point was, you know what? I'm going to be what I can be to those I'm with.
That's right. Go ahead, Daniel.
Did we bring in Brian Haynes' comment before? Did I miss that?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I read that earlier. I think.
All right.
Yeah. Now, Randall, just so that you'll know, or Paul, whoever would prefer, our neighbor across the street called a possum. So,
Right.
if you're hungry.
So well, you know what? I'm not sure we did bring Brian's statement. Basically, what he said is Paul would declare that his compulsion was the love of Christ. That's what compelled him to do what he did.
Yeah. I had read that.
Did we read that?
Yeah, I had read that. Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry.
No,
But he read it as if he was. John read it as if he was saying it, rather than giving the credit to Brian, so that
Right. Okay.
It more highly esteemed him.
Okay.
Not.
All righty. The last thing to point out, because we are past the top of the hour now, verse 23. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. We might want to talk about this next week. Is he's talking about his right to be supported? The English Standard Version says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing. Or is it talking about the blessings of the gospel itself, being a partaker of that gospel?
Well,
The sacrifice he makes.
Yeah.
Say again, Paul?
I think it's the sacrifices that he's making.
Yeah.
They're the becoming weak to win the weak. Those under the law, those without the law, whatever it is, he is trying to make sure that the whole thing is the gospel's sake, and that he might be able to, the thing that he's become a partaker in, the grace of God, salvation, that others can all partake in that together.
Right.
Well, and I think too, if you're a preacher and you never help somebody become a Christian, it's hard to share in the benefits of nothing. So if you're preaching the gospel and there's fruit from your labor, then there's something to share in. And so that's why he adapts to those, because ultimately, although obviously God is his first priority and he's putting other people above himself, it's also in his best interest too that he do these things as well, so that he can share in the blessings that come from it also.
That's a good point. Good thought. Good thought. All right, so are we ready then next Wednesday to start with verse 24?
I think we can, and there's sort of a slightly different thought that's brought forth there, so that'd be a good place.
Okay.
Sounds good to me, brother.
All right. Well, let's plan to do that then. Next Wednesday, we'll resume our study with 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. Gentlemen, as we close our study today, any final words or comments? Let's start with you, Daniel.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I know that guest 343 was on, and I know him. His name's Nate Sharp. He's a young man in Lake the Ozarks, Missouri, and he's been working on doing some appointment preaching and training with my dad, and so just keep him in your prayers as he continues to study, and I think he's going to try to be on here every week with us.
Very good. Very good. Good to have you with us here, Nate, today. Paul?
I'm just glad that you've all joined. If you have any questions, you can send that to Daniel or to Tom or Paul or John at truthfactor.com, just our first name at truthfactor.com. Or to get to all of us, questions, plural, questions at truthfactor.com. And if there's a question or a comment that you wanted to make that did not get entered into the chat, we'd be happy to talk with you about that via email or to give you a call and discuss those things as we have opportunity. Thanks for joining us today. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, everyone, always. Like I said, I enjoy this hour. Look forward to next week. John?
Thank you so much for joining us here today, and Lord willing, we will be back here again next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That's 12 noon Eastern Time.
9 a.m. Pacific Time.
And about sunrise at 6 a.m. Hawaii time.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.